I'm very excited for us to have the inaugural meeting of the Japan Society of Boston's Poetry Club. So this is a bi-monthly series that's going to bring us together to discuss and create poetry in two different kinds of styles of classical Japanese poetry, waka and haiku. Haiku is what you might be more familiar with in its modern day term, which is haiku. But back in the day when it was first the new and up and coming genre, it was called haiku. So my name is Michelle, and I am going to be your series host, and I'm really excited to be part of this wonderful event. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your poems and hearing your thoughts on the poems that I'm going to introduce to you, some of which I have just translated somewhat recently. So I'm also eager to hear your thoughts on those translations. And if you have other suggestions, everything goes. So eager for this to be a very interactive experience. And I forgot to mention this in the works cited slide, which is in the end of this PowerPoint, but the background image here is from a resource that I didn't actually include. So if you're interested in that, in finding the resource, I can let you know afterwards. Just go ahead and write that question in the chat and I can send you that information at a later date. Okay. If we could have the next slide, Naoko-san. So just a brief overview of these meetings. Each meeting will be roughly divided into two parts. The first will be devoted to presentation of a few classical poems and a group discussion. And the presentation portion of that will be recorded, but we don't need to record the discussion section if people aren't comfortable with that. And then the second half will be devoted to writing and sharing our own work. All the presented poems will be translated in English, and everyone is welcome to write their own poems in either Japanese or English, whatever you feel most comfortable with. If you want to try challenging and writing a poem in a language that's not your native language, go for it. Each meeting, because it will probably include a diversity of language and creative writing backgrounds, I think that what the level of interest in the various language components is going to be really different. Okay, so as the title says, our theme for this meeting is Locked Gates and Distant Loved Ones, Classical Japanese Poems to Enjoy in Pandemic Times. So today I'll introduce 3 verses, which they're not specifically composed about pandemic life, but I felt that they really resonated with the challenges and the opportunities that these past 2 years have brought to us, which is why I would like to share them with you today. The first poem that I'd like to introduce is a Waka Verse, which is a 31-syllable poem in a 5-7-5-7-7 pattern. And this poem is written by Kakinomoto no Hitomaro. We don't know exactly the dates of Hitomaro's time, but we do know that he was a mid-ranking courtier who served as a court poet to at least 3 sovereigns between the years of 673 and 707. He's one of the most treasured poets in Japan, and the image here on the left is his portrait from the Hyakunin Isshu, which is a collection of 100 exemplary verses from 100 Waka poets. The source for the poem that I'm going to talk about today is from an early 14th century poetic fragment of multiple poems, which are copied from the 11th century anthology, A Collection of Gleanings. And this poetic fragment was then pasted into what's called a Mirror of Hands, Tekagami calligraphy album, which is currently housed at the University of Oregon. And if I could have the next slide, please. So this is the opening page for the digital exhibition for this Mirror of Hands calligraphy website. So this is where I first encountered the poem while I was researching the various fragments from this calligraphy album, which is part of this digital exhibition. And it was created by the wonderful art history professor, Akiko Wally, absolutely brilliant. If you have any interest in art history, I highly recommend her work. And if you have interest in Japanese calligraphy, I encourage you to visit this wonderful digital exhibition. And the link is in the very last slide of the PowerPoint. Okay, next slide, please. So there are a number of great poems in this digital exhibition, but the one in particular that moved me the most is this one here. It's beautifully calligraphed in one long line in a fragment along with several other poems. And the poems read from top to bottom and right to left. And the poem that we're going to talk about today is highlighted here in blue. And it reads as follows. Minato iri no 足分けを船、触りをみ、我が思う人に会わぬ頃かな。Many of the poems from the albums are from anthologies that have already been translated, in which case I usually just choose one of the existing translations and add it to the exhibition. But when a poem has no pre-existing translation, then I provide one. And I usually write several different versions as a way of kind of feeling my way to the sort of the one that fits best for me. And these are the two most recent versions of translations that I wrote for this poem. Time apart from the one I love is as endless as the reeds choking a small boat's way to harbor. And then the final one, the most recent one, how endless this time apart from the one I love, as thick as reeds outstretched before a small boat pushing its way to harbor. What I love about this poem is how beautifully it conveys through simile how full of agony the time and space is that separates the speaker from his lover. The lover is figured in the harbor, while the poet is the small boat struggling its way through thick, seemingly endless reedy obstacles. And time passes as slowly as each labored stroke of the oars as the boat parts another foot of the dense waters. Amidst our COVID era, these feelings of longing and unwanted restraint resonated powerfully for me with feelings of being separated from our loved ones. And then on the next slide, we have the poem again in a sort of a rough word for word diagram, along with some of my earlier translations, which I'll read for you briefly. There are many obstacles for a little boat parting the harbor reeds. Oh, these times when I do not see my love. A tiny boat cutting through the harbor's thick reeds faces many obstructions. So too do I, whenever I am not with the one I love. How endless the snags this reed-parting dinghy faces as it heads to harbor. Such are the times I am without the one I love. So the version that I ended up settling on is in the next slide on the right-hand side. I inverted the order of the metaphoric language and the speaker's longing in order to convey the poetic emotion. And I began the poem with how endless to draw attention to the parallel being drawn between the endlessness of the reedy waters and the lover's time apart. But of course, poetry is always deeply personal, so I'd love to hear your thoughts during our discussion or your suggestions, if you have any, for anybody who might feel comfortable sharing. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's shift to a younger genre of poetry, haiku, which is better known by its modern name, haiku. So haiku is actually a general term under which any number of poetic activities fall, but one single poem is typically called a hokku. So today we're going to read two hokku from the genre's most famous figure, Matsuo Basho, who's pictured here in the collection 100 Haiku Verses. Both of his poems were written during a period when Basho underwent this time of self-imposed isolation, and that was in 1693 for about a period of about a month where he locked himself away in his home. he withdrew from the world and turned to the quiet transience of nature. And the first poem that we're going to read is a celebration of that decision. And it was written at the beginning of his self-isolation. Asagao ya, hiru wa jo orosu, mon no kaki. Morning Glories. At noon, fastening a lock, the gated fence. The poem begins with the exclamatory asagao ya, morning glories, a seasonal word for early autumn. Then the speaker enters the edge of the poem as a figure fastening a lock, a tool which isn't meant for the morning glory, but for the hustle and bustle beyond the poet's gated fence. While social demands continue apace beyond, Basho and the morning glories exist at a peaceful remove inside the fence. The one potential disruption, the entryway, is firmly, triumphantly shut. I've loved this image evoked here for so many years, having studied Basho for a long time. And when these new COVID norms settled in, I felt a similar sense of satisfaction with my own socially distant circumstances, even though mine weren't self-imposed, obviously. I was really relieved to have some time to myself to write, to research, and to do a little self-care. Maybe I'd get back into yoga or finally organize my office. I had plans, and like Basho, I was really pleased to focus on them. But the ambitions of my early days faded after a while. My writing wasn't going as I wanted it to, and I wasn't feeling any more mindful or peaceful than I wanted to be. Basho seems to have felt similarly because in his isolation, he wrote the following. Asagao ya, kore mo mata waga tomo narazu. Morning glories. Even these are not my friends. The morning glories of the first poem, Asagao ya, are the same. The first syllables are exactly the same. So they are unchanged within the second poem. But while the morning glories twine unchanging, the poet is now disgruntled, and he's now a friendless figure locked away in isolation at the center of the poem.